On a brisk autumn morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a local delivery driver named Ray was making his usual rounds. At 32, he had been delivering packages in this area for over 5 years, and he prided himself on knowing most of his regular customers by name. The gentle rustle of fallen leaves accompanied his footsteps as he approached the modest white house at the end of Cedar Street. Mrs. Chen, a sweet elderly woman in her late 70s, had been receiving more packages than usual lately. Ray had noticed this change in pattern over the past few weeks, but today something felt different. As he walked up the cracked concrete path leading to her front door, the usually well-maintained garden looked neglected, with weeds starting to take over the once pristine flower beds. The package in his hands was another medical supplies delivery, the third one this week. Ray had always exchanged pleasant conversations with Mrs. Chen, but lately, their interactions had become shorter, and she seemed more withdrawn. Today, as she opened the door, Ray's trained eye caught something concerning. There were unusual brownish stains on her light-colored cardigan. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," Ray said warmly, though his heart rate quickened with worry. "I've got another delivery for you today." Mrs. Chen's usually bright eyes seemed distant as she reached for the package. Her hands trembled slightly, and Ray noticed more stains on her sleeve. The interior of the house, visible through the doorway, was darker than usual, with all the curtains drawn. A musty smell wafted out, unlike the usual aroma of fresh-baked cookies that had once greeted him. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. As she moved to close the door, Ray noticed she was favoring her left leg, walking with a slight limp that hadn't been there before. Something in Ray's gut told him this wasn't right. In his years of delivery work, he'd developed a sixth sense about his customers, especially the elderly ones who lived alone. Mrs. Chen had always been independent and proud of her home, but the signs of neglect were becoming impossible to ignore. "Mrs. Chen," Ray said gently, placing his foot subtly to prevent the door from closing completely. "I couldn't help but notice, is everything all right?" "The garden." He gestured to the overgrown flower beds, trying to find a non-intrusive way to express his concern. She hesitated, her hand gripping the doorframe tightly. For a moment, the facade cracked, and Ray saw fear flash across her face. "I'm fine," she insisted, but her voice wavered. "Just been a little under the weather." Ray thought about his own grandmother, who lived across the country. If she were in trouble, he'd want someone to check on her. Making a quick decision, he pulled out his phone. "I have a few more deliveries, but I'll be done in about an hour. Would it be okay if I came back to help you with the garden? My afternoon is free, and it would be no trouble at all." Mrs. Chen's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "You don't have to do that," she said, but Ray could hear the relief in her voice. "I insist," Ray said firmly but kindly. "My grandmother taught me never to ignore a garden in need of care." This brought a small smile to Mrs. Chen's face, the first he'd seen in weeks. As Ray walked back to his delivery van, his mind raced. The stains on her clothes, the limping, the darkened house, something wasn't right. He'd seen enough news stories about elder abuse and neglect to know the warning signs. But he also knew he needed to approach this situation carefully. During his remaining deliveries, Ray couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Chen. He remembered how she used to talk proudly about her grandchildren's visits, but he hadn't heard her mention them in months. The medical supply deliveries had started around the same time the changes in her behavior began. Ray called his supervisor, explaining that he needed to take his lunch break at a specific time. His supervisor, knowing Ray's reliable track record, agreed without question. Then, Ray made another call, this time to his friend at the local senior services center, asking for advice on how to handle situations involving potential elder neglect. As he drove back to Mrs. Chen's house, Ray felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He wasn't just a delivery driver anymore, he was possibly the only person who had noticed these troubling changes. The thought of what he might discover inside that house made him nervous, but he knew he couldn't look the other way. Pulling up to the curb, Ray took a deep breath. The autumn sun was high in the sky now, casting shadows through the unkempt branches of Mrs. Chen's maple tree. He gathered the gardening gloves he kept in his van for deliveries to community gardens and walked back up the familiar concrete path. This time, when Mrs. Chen opened the door, something had changed. Perhaps it was knowing that someone had noticed, or maybe it was the simple act of kindness, but tears began rolling down her cheeks. "I didn't know who to tell," she whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched her cardigan closer. Ray's heart sank as he realized this was just the beginning of what promised to be a much bigger story. The stains on her clothes, he would soon discover, were just the tip of the iceberg. But standing there on her porch, he made a silent promise to help this kind woman who had always greeted him with a smile and sometimes cookies during his deliveries. What Ray would uncover in the next few hours would not only change Mrs. Chen's life but would also remind their entire community about the importance of looking out for one another, especially those most vulnerable among them. The story of a simple delivery driver's concern would soon become a powerful testament to the impact that one person's attention and care can have on another's life. As Ray stepped into Mrs. Chen's home, the contrast between the bright autumn day outside and the darkness within was jarring. The curtains were drawn tight, and a musty smell hung in the air. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim light, and what he saw made his heart sink even further. The once immaculate home was in complete disarray. Unopened mail was scattered across the coffee table, and dust had settled on the family photos that lined the walls. The kitchen, visible from the entryway, had dishes piled in the sink, very unlike the Mrs. Chen he had known who took such pride in her home. "Let me open these curtains for you," Ray suggested gently, moving toward the windows. Mrs. Chen didn't protest, but he noticed her nervous glance toward the staircase leading to the second floor. As sunlight flooded the room, more details emerged that heightened Ray's concerns. There were water stains on the ceiling, and the carpet showed signs of neglect. "Would you like some tea?" Mrs. Chen offered, her ingrained sense of hospitality surfacing despite her distress. Her hands trembled as she tried to lift the kettle. "Let me help with that," Ray said, stepping forward. As he took the kettle, he noticed something else. There were prescription bottles on the counter, many of them untouched. Some had dates from weeks ago. While the water heated, Ray carefully broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Mrs. Chen, I couldn't help but notice you seem to be having some difficulty getting around. Is someone helping you with your daily needs?" The elderly woman's face crumpled slightly. She lowered herself into a kitchen chair, wincing as she did so. "My son," she began, then stopped, twisting her stained cardigan between her fingers. He's been busy with work. He says he'll fix things when he has time." Ray noticed how she avoided making eye contact and mentioning her son. He remembered her talking about him months ago, a successful businessman who had moved to the area recently. At the time, Mrs. Chen had been overjoyed about having him nearby. "And your grandchildren?" Ray asked, keeping his tone conversational as he poured the tea. "You used to tell me about their visits." A tear rolled down Mrs. Chen's cheek. "They're not allowed to come anymore," she whispered. He says I'm not safe to be around them. That I might hurt myself or them because I'm getting forgetful." Ray felt a chill run down his spine despite the steam rising from the teacups. He had delivered packages to Mrs. Chen for years, and while she occasionally misplaced things like any other person, she had always been sharp and aware. As they sipped their tea, Ray noticed more concerning details. There were small bruises on Mrs. Chen's arms, partially hidden by her cardigan. The stains he had noticed earlier looked like coffee spills, but some appeared older, suggesting she had been wearing the same clothes for days. "Mrs. Chen," Ray said carefully, "I noticed you're getting a lot of medical supplies delivered. Are you able to get to your doctor's appointments?" She shook her head slowly. "My son, he says he'll take me, but something always comes up." He keeps ordering supplies online instead. He has my credit card. Her voice trailed off, and she looked frightened, as if she'd said too much. Just then, they heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Mrs. Chen's face went pale. "You have to go," she said urgently, standing up so quickly she almost knocked over her tea. "Please, you have to leave now." Ray stood his ground. "Mrs. Chen, if you're in trouble, I can help. There are people who can." "No," she said forcefully, though her voice shook. "You don't understand. He'll be angry. Please, go out the back door. Quickly." The front door opened before Ray could respond. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, and a man's voice called out, "Mom? Why is there a delivery van outside?" Ray watched as Mrs. Chen seemed to shrink into herself, her earlier panic giving way to a resigned weariness that broke his heart. The footsteps grew closer, and a well-dressed man appeared in the kitchen doorway. His expensive suit and polished appearance contrasted sharply with the deteriorating condition of the house. "What's going on here?" the man demanded, his professional demeanor barely masking his anger. "Who are you?" "I'm Ray, the regular delivery driver for this route," Ray replied calmly, though his pulse was racing. "Mrs. Chen mentioned having trouble with her garden, so I offered to help." The man's face twisted into a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's very kind of you, but unnecessary. My mother is well taken care of. I handle everything she needs." Ray noticed how Mrs. Chen seemed to fade into the background, her eyes fixed on the floor. The son moved to stand between them, his body language clearly indicating that Ray should leave. But Ray had seen enough. The signs were too clear, the situation too dire to ignore. He had made a promise to himself on that porch, and he intended to keep it. As he walked toward the front door, seemingly complying with the unspoken dismissal, his hand slipped into his pocket, where his phone had been quietly recording the entire conversation, something his friend at Senior Services had advised him to do. The story was far from over. What Ray had discovered in Mrs. Chen's house would set in motion a chain of events that would expose a disturbing truth about elder abuse hiding behind a facade of affluence and family responsibility. But for now, he had to play it smart. Mrs. Chen's safety depended on his next moves. As he walked back to his delivery van, Ray could feel the son's eyes watching him from the window. He started his engine and drove away, but his mind was already formulating a plan. Sometimes, he realized, delivering justice was just as important as delivering packages. Back in his delivery van, Ray's hands shook slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The recording on his phone contained evidence of something deeply troubling, but he knew he had to be strategic about his next steps. Mrs. Chen's situation was too delicate to rush into without a proper plan. He pulled over a few blocks away and called his contact at Senior Services, Officer Linda Thompson. "I need your help," he said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing thoughts. "It's worse than we suspected." As Ray described what he'd witnessed, Linda's voice grew serious. "You did the right thing by recording the interaction," she assured him. "But we need more evidence to build a solid case. Financial abuse of the elderly is unfortunately common, but it's often difficult to prove, especially when family members are involved." She mentioned her credit card, Ray said, remembering Mrs. Chen's fearful expression. "And all those medical supplies being delivered, something doesn't add up. He's ordering them online instead of taking her to actual doctors." While they talked, Ray noticed another delivery van pull up to Mrs. Chen's house, this one from a different company. An idea began to form in his mind. "Linda, what if we could get other delivery drivers involved? Create a network of eyes and ears?" "That could work," Linda replied thoughtfully. "But we need to move carefully. If her son suspects anything, he might isolate her completely." Over the next few days, Ray put his plan into action. During his breaks, he reached out to other delivery drivers who serviced the area. He'd gotten to know many of them during his years on the route, sharing friendly waves and occasional conversations at coffee shops. At a local diner before their morning routes, Ray met with 4 other drivers. "I need your help keeping an eye on one of my elderly customers," he explained, showing them Mrs. Chen's address. "Something's not right, and we might be the only ones who can help." The drivers agreed to document anything unusual they noticed, the frequency of deliveries, the types of packages, and any interactions with Mrs. Chen or her son. They created a group chat to share information, being careful to keep their observations professional and factual. Meanwhile, Ray continued his regular deliveries to Mrs. Chen's house. Her son seemed to be there more often now, always answering the door himself with that same artificial smile. "You can just leave the packages on the porch," he would say dismissively, but Ray caught glimpses of Mrs. Chen in the background, looking more withdrawn each time. The evidence began to mount. One driver reported delivering expensive electronics that seemed unusual for an elderly woman living alone. Another noticed multiple deliveries of prescription medications from different online pharmacies. Ray's friend at the post office mentioned seeing large bank statements and multiple credit card bills. A breakthrough came when one of the drivers overheard an argument while delivering a package. The son's voice had carried through an open window, "Stop complaining about the pills. Do you know how much trouble you're causing me? Just take them and stay quiet." Ray immediately shared this information with Linda. "We're building a pattern," she explained. "The financial records show unusual spending patterns, and the multiple prescriptions from different sources are a red flag. We're also concerned about potential overmedication." But the situation reached a critical point one rainy afternoon. Ray was making his usual delivery when he heard a crash from inside the house, followed by Mrs. Chen's frightened voice. Without hesitation, he pressed the doorbell. The son opened the door, blocking the entrance. Behind him, Ray could see broken glass on the floor and Mrs. Chen holding her arm, tears streaming down her face. "Is everything okay in there?" Ray asked, his heart pounding. "I heard a noise." "Everything's fine," the son snapped. "My mother just dropped something. We don't need any help." But Mrs. Chen suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "Help," she said softly, then louder, "Please help me." The son whirled around. "Mom, be quiet. You're confused again." In that moment, Ray made a decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, keeping his eyes fixed on the son. "I'm at 1847 Cedar Street," he said clearly. "I'm witnessing a possible assault on an elderly woman." The son's face contorted with rage. He moved toward Ray, but stopped when he heard sirens in the distance. They were closer than expected. Linda had arranged for a patrol car to stay in the area, anticipating that something might happen. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived, followed shortly by Linda from Senior Services. As they approached the house, the son began trying to explain everything away, but Mrs. Chen, seeing the support around her, finally found her courage. "He takes my money," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He keeps me here, gives me pills I don't need. I want to go home, my real home." The officers separated Mrs. Chen and her son, taking statements from both. Ray provided the recordings and evidence he'd gathered from the delivery driver network. Linda already had a file ready with the financial records and prescription information they'd been collecting. As Mrs. Chen was gently led to Linda's car to be taken somewhere safe, she stopped beside Ray. "You saw me," she said simply, tears in her eyes. "When I was invisible to everyone else, you saw me." Ray watched as the son was questioned by police, his expensive suit and polished appearance no longer able to mask the truth of his actions. The facade had crumbled, revealing the dark reality that had been hiding behind closed doors. But this wasn't the end of the story. As Ray would soon learn, Mrs. Chen's case would spark a larger investigation that would expose similar situations throughout the community. The delivery driver network he'd created would become a model for other cities, proving that sometimes the most effective protection for vulnerable people comes from those who see them every day. In the days following Mrs. Chen's rescue, Ray couldn't stop thinking about how many other elderly residents might be suffering in silence. His delivery route felt different now, each house holding the potential for hidden stories, each interaction carrying new weight. The local police station had become a hub of activity. Detective Rivera, who specialized in elderly abuse cases, called Ray in to provide a detailed statement. The detective's office walls were covered with papers and photos, suggesting Mrs. Chen's case had opened a much larger investigation. "Your delivery driver network was brilliant," Detective Rivera said, reviewing the evidence they'd gathered. "We've already identified 3 more suspicious situations in neighboring districts. But what I really want to know is, how did you first notice something was wrong?" Ray thought carefully before answering. "It was the little things," he explained. The garden she loved suddenly untended. The way she stopped mentioning her grandchildren. But mostly, it was the change in her eyes, like her spirit was fading. The detective nodded, making notes. Those subtle changes are often the first signs. Most people don't notice them, or if they do, they don't want to get involved. But you did something different. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen was staying at a secure senior care facility, where she was receiving proper medical evaluation and support. Ray had visited her twice, each time seeing more of her old spark returning. The facility's doctor had been working to safely wean her off the unnecessary medications her son had been forcing her to take. During one visit, Mrs. Chen shared her story with Ray. "It started small," she said, her hands wrapped around a cup of green tea, properly prepared this time, not the hasty bags her son had bought in bulk. "After my husband passed, my son suggested I sell my house and move closer to him. He said he'd manage my money, make things easier for me." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "But then he started saying I was becoming forgetful, dangerous. He took my phone, told my friends I was too sick for visitors. The grandchildren's visits stopped. He said it was for my own good, that he was protecting me. I started believing him." Ray listened, his heart heavy but hopeful, seeing how much stronger she'd become in just a few days of proper care. The bruises were fading, and she'd traded the stained cardigan for a clean, flowered blouse that brightened her complexion. The investigation into her son's activities revealed a disturbing pattern. He had been systematically draining her accounts, using her credit cards, and selling her valuable possessions. The medical supplies being delivered were part of an insurance fraud scheme. He'd been billing for equipment and medications that weren't necessary. But perhaps the most significant development came from the delivery driver network Ray had created. His fellow drivers had started paying closer attention to their elderly customers, noticing signs they might have missed before. They'd developed a simple but effective system for reporting concerns without raising suspicion. One afternoon, Ray received a call from Linda at Senior Services. "Your idea is spreading," she said excitedly. "Other delivery companies are implementing similar training programs. They're teaching drivers what signs to watch for, how to document concerns, when to alert authorities." The local community center organized a workshop where Ray shared his experience. Standing before a room full of delivery drivers, postal workers, and community members, he felt both humble and empowered. "You might be the only person some seniors see regularly," he told the audience. "You might be their only connection to the outside world. That makes you more than just someone dropping off packages, you're a lifeline." The initiative gained attention from local media. A community newspaper ran a feature story, careful to protect Mrs. Chen's privacy while highlighting the importance of watching out for vulnerable neighbors. The article led to an increase in calls to senior services, as people began recognizing similar patterns in their own communities. Mrs. Chen's son faced criminal charges, but she found peace in an unexpected way. "I don't hate him," she told Ray during another visit. "I pity him. He lost his way, forgot what family really means. But look what happened because of it, so many people are being helped now. She had decided to share her story anonymously through senior advocacy groups, helping other elderly individuals recognize warning signs of abuse and manipulation. Her experience became a powerful teaching tool, showing how abuse often begins subtly and escalates over time. The facility's garden became her new pride and joy. Ray would sometimes find her there, teaching other residents about different plants, her hands happily dirty from tending to new growth. She'd started writing letters to her grandchildren again, rebuilding those precious relationships that had been severed. One day, while making his regular deliveries, Ray noticed something that made him smile. Several houses on his route had new, Safe Senior Network stickers in their windows, part of a community initiative that grew from Mrs. Chen's case. The stickers let delivery drivers know these homes were part of a neighborhood watch program specifically focused on elderly residents. The story could have ended with Mrs. Chen's rescue, but instead, it sparked a movement. What began as one delivery driver's concern had grown into a community-wide commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members. Senior isolation became a topic of regular discussion at community meetings, and new programs were developed to keep elderly residents connected and engaged. As Ray drove his route now, he saw his job differently. Every delivery was an opportunity to make a difference, every interaction a chance to ensure someone's safety and well-being. The packages he carried weren't just boxes, they were daily reminders that someone cared enough to check in, to notice, to act. Mrs. Chen's garden at the facility had become a symbol of renewal and hope. Where her old garden had withered under neglect, this new one flourished with the care of many hands. Like the community itself, it had grown stronger through attention and dedication, proving that when people look out for one another, beautiful things can bloom from even the darkest situations. 3 months after Mrs. Chen's rescue, Ray stood before a packed auditorium at the State Elder Care Conference. His delivery uniform felt a bit out of place among the suits and formal attire, but Linda had insisted he wear it. "It's part of your story," she'd said. "It shows that heroes come from everyday places." As Ray shared his experience, he could see members of the audience wiping away tears. The network of vigilant delivery drivers had expanded beyond their small community, spreading to neighboring cities and even other states. What started as a simple act of concern had evolved into a movement. "Last week, I delivered a package to an elderly gentleman," Ray told the audience. "He recognized me from a news story about Mrs. Chen's case. He pulled out his wallet and showed me a picture of his sister. I hadn't seen her in months," he told me. "Her children kept saying she was too sick for visitors. After hearing about your story, I insisted on seeing her. Turns out she was being kept isolated, just like Mrs. Chen." The ripple effects of Mrs. Chen's case continued to spread. Detective Rivera had established a specialized task force focused on elder abuse, working closely with delivery companies to train their drivers in recognizing warning signs. The program was dubbed Eyes on the Street, and it had already led to the discovery and prevention of numerous cases of elder abuse. Back at the senior care facility, Mrs. Chen had become something of a quiet leader. She started a gardening therapy program, teaching other residents how to nurture plants and find joy in watching them grow. The facility's once bland courtyard had transformed into a vibrant garden, filled with flowers, vegetables, and herbs. "When my son first started controlling my life," she confided to Ray during one of his regular visits, "I forgot who I was. I became the confused, helpless person he claimed I was. But now," she gestured to the thriving garden around them, "now I remember my strength." The investigation into her son's activities had revealed a complex web of financial exploitation. He had been using similar tactics with other elderly individuals, presenting himself as a financial advisor while systematically draining their accounts. The evidence gathered through the delivery driver network had been crucial in building a case against him. One afternoon, Ray received an unexpected call from a rehabilitation center. It was Mrs. Chen's son, reaching out after starting therapy as part of his plea agreement. "I've been thinking about what I did," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I convinced myself I was protecting her, managing her affairs. But I became the very thing I claimed to be protecting her from." Ray listened carefully, remembering Mrs. Chen's words about pity rather than hate. The son's actions were inexcusable, but understanding the mindset that led to them could help prevent similar situations in the future. The Safe Senior Network had expanded to include not just delivery drivers, but also postal workers, utility meter readers, and other service providers who regularly visited homes. They created a simple but effective system using colored cards placed in windows, green meaning all was well, yellow requesting a check-in, and red signaling urgent assistance needed. Local businesses joined the initiative. Pharmacies began training their staff to recognize signs of prescription abuse and financial exploitation. Grocery stores implemented programs to ensure elderly customers had access to fresh food and essential supplies. Banks developed enhanced protocols for detecting suspicious patterns in elderly clients' accounts. Mrs. Chen's grandchildren had become regular visitors at the facility. Ray often saw them in the garden with their grandmother, learning about different plants and helping with the weeding. The youngest one had started a school project about elder abuse awareness, inspired by his grandmother's experience. One day, while making his usual deliveries, Ray noticed an elderly woman sitting alone on her porch. Before Mrs. Chen's case, he might have simply dropped off the package and continued his route. Now, he took a moment to chat with her. The conversation revealed she had been struggling to maintain her independence after her husband's death. "Would you like me to connect you with some resources?" Ray offered, thinking of the network of support that had grown from Mrs. Chen's case. The woman's grateful smile reminded him of Mrs. Chen's words, "You saw me when I was invisible." The delivery driver network had begun documenting their experiences, creating a database of subtle signs and patterns that might indicate elder abuse. What seemed like minor details, unkempt gardens, changes in delivery patterns, unusual interactions, could often be the first indicators of a larger problem. Mrs. Chen's story had also inspired changes in local legislation. The city council passed new regulations requiring enhanced training for caregivers and stricter oversight of in-home care situations. Financial institutions implemented additional safeguards for elderly clients' accounts. During a community awareness event, Ray stood beside Mrs. Chen as she shared her story publicly for the first time. Her voice was strong and clear as she described her experience, no longer the fearful whisper it had been months ago. The audience listened intently, many taking notes on the warning signs she described. The hardest part wasn't the physical abuse or the financial exploitation, she told them. It was the isolation, the feeling that I had no voice, no power. But thanks to one person who paid attention, who refused to look away, I found my voice again. And now, I use it to help others find theirs. The story of the delivery driver and the elderly woman had become more than just a tale of rescue. It had evolved into a testament to the power of community awareness and action. It showed that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest observations, and that heroes often wear the most ordinary uniforms. As Ray finished his route each day, he knew that every package he delivered could be an opportunity to make a difference. The network he helped create had become a safety net for the community's most vulnerable members, proving that when people come together with purpose and compassion, they can weave protection from the threads of everyday interactions. 1 year after Ray first noticed those concerning stains on Mrs. Chen's cardigan, he sat in the audience of a national conference on elder care, watching her receive an award for her advocacy work. The once frightened woman who had whispered for help now stood confidently at the podium, her voice carrying clearly through the packed convention center. "When darkness surrounds you," Mrs. Chen said, her eyes finding Ray in the crowd, "it only takes one person to light a path forward. But what's remarkable is how that light spreads, how it inspires others to shine their own lights until the darkness retreats completely." The Safe Senior Network had grown beyond anything Ray could have imagined. What started as a small group of delivery drivers sharing observations had evolved into a nationwide movement. Companies across the country were implementing similar programs, training their frontline workers to recognize and report signs of elder abuse. During a break in the conference, Ray wandered through an exhibition hall where various organizations showcased their elder care initiatives. He stopped at a booth displaying familiar green, yellow, and red window cards, now enhanced with QR codes that could be scanned to immediately connect seniors with appropriate services. "Your story inspired all of this," said a voice behind him. Ray turned to find Detective Rivera, who had traveled to the conference to present their community's success story. "But do you know what the most significant change has been?" Ray shook his head, and the detective continued, "It's not just about catching abuse anymore, it's about preventing it. We're seeing families reaching out for help before situations escalate. The shame and silence around elder abuse is finally breaking." Back at the senior care facility, Mrs. Chen's garden had become a model for therapeutic programs nationwide. Professional caregivers visited regularly to learn about her approach to healing through horticulture. The garden had expanded to include a memorial section, dedicated to elderly individuals who had suffered in silence before the network began its work. One morning, while tending to her beloved plants, Mrs. Chen received an unexpected visitor, her son's counselor from the rehabilitation program. The counselor shared how her son's story was being used to help others understand the complex dynamics of elder abuse, particularly when perpetrated by family members. "He asks about you," the counselor said gently. "He's doing the work to understand his actions and their impact. Would you be willing to participate in a restorative justice session?" Mrs. Chen looked out over her garden, watching butterflies dance among the flowers. "A garden teaches us that growth requires both nurturing and pruning," she replied thoughtfully. "Perhaps it's time to see what can grow from this pain." The Safe Senior Network had begun partnering with technology companies to develop innovative solutions for elderly care. A new app allowed delivery drivers to log their observations securely, creating a database that could help identify patterns of concern. GPS tracking helped ensure that seniors received their deliveries on time, with alerts if regular deliveries were missed. Ray's role had evolved as well. While he still drove his regular route, he now spent part of each week training other drivers and speaking at community events. His simple observation about an untended garden had sparked a revolution in how communities looked after their elderly members. During one training session, a new driver asked Ray how he dealt with the emotional weight of witnessing potential abuse situations. Ray shared a memory from the early days of Mrs. Chen's case. "I remembered my own grandmother, and I asked myself, what would I want someone to do if she were in trouble? Sometimes, the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do." The legislative changes continued to expand. Several states had adopted new laws requiring enhanced screening for caregivers and stricter penalties for elder abuse. Financial institutions implemented special protection programs for elderly clients, with trained staff members dedicated to monitoring suspicious activities. Mrs. Chen's grandchildren had become regular advocates for elder rights. The youngest one, now in high school, had started a club dedicated to connecting students with elderly members of the community. They helped with gardening, home maintenance, and most importantly, provided regular companionship. One day, while working in the garden together, Mrs. Chen's youngest grandchild asked her a profound question, "Grandma, are you angry that it took so long for someone to help you?" Mrs. Chen paused in her weeding, considering the question carefully. "I was angry at first," she admitted. "But then I realized that my story helped create something beautiful. Now, instead of being angry about the past, I'm hopeful about the future." The Delivery Driver Network had begun hosting monthly community dinners where elderly residents could socialize and share their experiences. These gatherings became a vital source of support and connection, breaking down the isolation that often made seniors vulnerable to abuse. During one such dinner, an elderly man stood up to share his story. "I saw the news about Mrs. Chen's case," he said, his voice trembling. I recognized my own situation. My daughter had been controlling my life, my money. Because of this network, I found the courage to speak up. Now I'm free, and my daughter is getting the help she needs. Ray's simple act of caring had created a ripple effect that continued to grow. Other service providers, mail carriers, utility workers, grocery delivery people, had joined the network, creating a comprehensive safety net for vulnerable seniors. The senior care facility where Mrs. Chen lived had become a model for others across the country. They'd implemented programs that balanced independence with support, ensuring that residents maintained their dignity while receiving necessary care. The garden therapy program had expanded to include art classes, music therapy, and other activities that promoted healing and connection. As Ray finished his deliveries each day, he often reflected on how much had changed in just 1 year. The simple act of noticing something wrong and choosing to act had transformed not just Mrs. Chen's life, but countless others. It proved that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest observations, and that heroism often wears the most ordinary disguises. 18 months after that first concerned observation, Ray stood in the community center's newly dedicated Chen Garden of Hope. The space had been transformed from an unused lot into a thriving community garden, where elderly residents worked alongside youth volunteers, sharing stories and wisdom while tending to the plants. Mrs. Chen moved carefully between the raised garden beds, showing a group of senior citizens how to care for the herbs she'd helped plant. Her hands, once trembling and marked with bruises, now moved with confidence as she demonstrated proper pruning techniques. The stained cardigan had long since been replaced by a collection of bright gardening aprons, each pocket filled with tools and seeds. Everything in a garden has its purpose, she told her eager students. Even the things we think of as problems, the fallen leaves, the withered plants, they become compost, nurturing new growth. Like our difficult experiences, they can help others bloom. The Safe Senior Network had evolved in ways no one could have predicted. What began as Ray's informal network of delivery drivers had grown into a sophisticated support system. The local success story had caught the attention of a major tech company, which developed a free app connecting seniors with verified service providers, from home maintenance to medical transport. During a morning delivery route, Ray received a call from Detective Rivera. "Remember how we wondered if there were others like Mrs. Chen's son?" the detective asked. "The pattern recognition software we developed from your delivery driver reports just flagged a series of suspicious activities in the next county. We're investigating 5 cases that might be connected." The ripple effects of Mrs. Chen's case had reached far beyond their community. Social work programs at universities had begun incorporating the delivery driver model into their curriculum, teaching future professionals about the importance of community-based observation networks in preventing elder abuse. One afternoon, while Ray was helping Mrs. Chen set up for a garden workshop, she shared some news. "I'm going to meet with my son next week," she said quietly, her hands steady as she arranged potted plants. "The counselor thinks he's ready, and I think I am too." The restorative justice program had been carefully preparing both mother and son for this meeting. Mrs. Chen's son had spent the past year in a rehabilitation program, working to understand the roots of his behavior and making amends through community service at senior centers. "I'm not expecting miracles," Mrs. Chen explained to Ray. "But understanding is like composting, it takes time to transform something painful into something useful. Maybe our story can help other families recognize warning signs before things go too far." The Safe Senior Network had begun partnering with local businesses to create senior-friendly zones, spaces where elderly residents could feel secure and supported. Cafes offered senior social hours, stores provided rest areas and assistance, and pharmacies implemented special protocols for monitoring prescription patterns. Ray's delivery company had become a national leader in community service, implementing mandatory training programs for all drivers based on his experience. Other companies followed suit, recognizing that their employees could serve as vital links in protecting vulnerable community members. During a national conference on aging, Ray shared the stage with Mrs. Chen as they presented their story to an audience of healthcare providers, social workers, and community leaders. The signs are often subtle, Ray explained. A neglected garden, a changed routine, a reluctance to speak freely. But now we know, these small details can tell a bigger story. Mrs. Chen added her perspective: isolation is the fertile ground where abuse takes root. But connection, real, caring connection, that's what helps us grow strong again. Every delivery, every conversation, every moment of genuine concern is like water and sunlight to a struggling plant. The network had begun documenting success stories, creating a powerful testament to the impact of community vigilance. An elderly man who hadn't seen his grandchildren in years was reunited with his family after a delivery driver noticed his distress. A woman living in fear of her caregiver found the courage to seek help after a package delivery led to a caring conversation. Local schools had integrated elder care awareness into their curriculum, with students learning about the importance of respecting and protecting older community members. Mrs. Chen's garden became a regular field trip destination, where students learned about both horticulture and human kindness. One morning, Ray discovered a surprise in his delivery van: a small potted plant with a note from Mrs. Chen. From one seed of kindness, the note read, "An entire garden can grow. Thank you for planting that first seed." The senior care facility had expanded its programs, creating a model that other institutions began to follow. They emphasized dignity, independence, and community connection, understanding that isolation often preceded abuse. The garden therapy program had grown to include mindfulness sessions, art therapy, and intergenerational activities. During a community gathering, an elderly resident shared how the network had changed her life. "I used to be afraid to answer my door," she admitted. "But now, when I see a delivery van, I know it's not just bringing packages, it's bringing a friendly face, a caring heart, someone who sees me as a person, not just an address." The technology developed for the Safe Senior Network had begun adapting to serve other vulnerable populations. The success of the program demonstrated that community-based observation networks, supported by appropriate technology and training, could help protect various at-risk groups. As Ray made his deliveries, he noticed how the neighborhood had changed. Gardens were better tended, seniors were more visible in the community, and there was a new awareness of the importance of looking out for one another. The stains on a cardigan that had first caught his attention had led to a transformation in how communities cared for their elderly members. Mrs. Chen's garden continued to flourish, but its true harvest wasn't in the vegetables or flowers it produced. It was in the connections it fostered, the healing it facilitated, and the hope it represented. Each plant told a story of resilience, each flower a testament to the power of paying attention and taking action. The story of the delivery driver and the elderly woman had become more than just a tale of rescue, it had evolved into a blueprint for community care, showing how ordinary people doing ordinary jobs could become extraordinary protectors of society's most vulnerable members. 2 years after Ray first noticed those telling stains on Mrs. Chen's cardigan, he parked his delivery van outside the newly opened Community Connection Center. The building, once a neglected community center, had been transformed into a hub for senior services, featuring a sprawling garden that Mrs. Chen had helped design. Inside, preparations were underway for a very special event. Mrs. Chen stood near a podium, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed her speech notes. Her grandson sat nearby, manning a video camera to document the occasion. The room was filled with familiar faces: delivery drivers, postal workers, community members, and dozens of seniors whose lives had been touched by the Safe Senior Network. "I never thought my story would lead to this," Mrs. Chen confided to Ray as he helped her arrange photographs for the display. The images showed the progression of their journey, from the neglected garden of her old house to the thriving community spaces that now dotted the city. Sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest futures. The meeting with her son had taken place 3 months earlier, under careful supervision from the Restorative Justice Program. While reconciliation remained a complex and ongoing process, both mother and son had taken important steps toward healing. He now volunteered at senior centers as part of his rehabilitation, sharing his story to help others recognize and prevent abusive behaviors. "He told me something important," Mrs. Chen shared with Ray. "He said that power and control are like weeds in a garden, they can grow quietly, choking out everything good if we don't recognize them early. Now he helps others identify these weeds before they take root." The Safe Senior Network had expanded to include innovative programs no one had initially imagined. Local restaurants had started a Dinner Connect program, where delivery drivers could flag seniors who might benefit from regular meal deliveries and social interaction. Grocery stores implemented special shopping hours with trained staff available to assist elderly customers and watch for signs of distress. During the ceremony, Detective Rivera presented impressive statistics. Elder abuse reports in their community had decreased by 40% since the network's inception, while early intervention cases had increased significantly. "We're not just responding to abuse anymore," she explained. "We're preventing it before it starts." Ray took his turn at the podium, his delivery uniform standing out among the formal attire. "2 years ago, I saw something wrong and decided to act," he began. "But the real story isn't about what I did, it's about what we all did together. Every person in this room has become a guardian, a protector, simply by paying attention and caring enough to act." The technology developed for the network had evolved remarkably. The app now included features for scheduling social visits, coordinating volunteer services, and maintaining a secure communication network between seniors and their trusted contacts. But perhaps more importantly, it had helped create a model for community-based protection that other cities were eagerly adopting. Mrs. Chen's garden therapy program had grown into a formal certification course, teaching others how to use horticulture as a healing tool for trauma survivors. "In the garden, everything has its season," she often told her students. "Healing is the same way, we can't rush it, but we can nurture it and watch it grow." The most powerful moment of the day came when a group of seniors took the stage to share their stories. Each had been helped by the network in some way, some rescued from abusive situations, others connected with services before crisis could develop. Their testimonies highlighted how simple acts of attention and kindness could change, and sometimes save, lives. One elderly gentleman spoke about how a delivery driver had noticed his mail piling up and checked on him, discovering he had fallen and couldn't reach his phone. A woman described how a routine package delivery led to her connecting with services that helped her escape financial exploitation by a caregiver. The Safe Senior Network had begun partnering with medical professionals, creating a more comprehensive approach to elder care. Delivery drivers' observations often provided valuable context for healthcare providers, helping them better understand their patients' living situations and potential risks. Local schools had fully embraced the Intergenerational Connection program. Students regularly visited the Community Connection Center, learning from seniors while providing companionship and assistance. The garden became a living classroom where wisdom and experience were shared alongside gardening tips. Ray's delivery company had made the training program a central part of their corporate mission, earning recognition as a leader in community service. Other companies followed suit, recognizing that their employees could serve as vital links in protecting vulnerable community members. Near the end of the ceremony, Mrs. Chen revealed a new initiative, a scholarship program for students pursuing careers in elder care and protection. "Education is like the soil in a garden," she explained. "When we enrich it, we create better conditions for future growth." The event concluded with the unveiling of a memorial wall, honoring seniors who had suffered in silence before the network began its work. Their stories served as powerful reminders of why the program was so vital, and why vigilance must be maintained. As the attendees mingled afterward, Ray noticed Mrs. Chen in the garden, showing her grandson how to plant new seedlings. The sight perfectly captured the program's essence, wisdom being passed down, new growth being nurtured, connections being strengthened. Every delivery is an opportunity, Ray reflected to a group of new drivers in training. Every interaction is a chance to make a difference. We're not just carrying packages, we're carrying hope, connection, and sometimes even salvation. The story that began with stains on a cardigan had blossomed into a movement that transformed how communities protect their vulnerable members. It proved that heroes often wear the most ordinary uniforms, that saving lives sometimes starts with simply paying attention, and that when people come together with purpose and compassion, remarkable change is possible. As the sun set on the celebration, Mrs. Chen stood in her garden one last time. From darkness to light, she said softly, touching a blooming flower. From isolation to connection. From fear to strength. This is how we grow, this is how we heal, this is how we protect one another. The legacy of the delivery driver and the elderly woman had become a testament to the power of community vigilance and caring intervention. Their story continued to inspire others to pay attention, to act with courage, and to remember that sometimes the smallest observations can lead to the most profound changes.